Hello and welcome back to another PS5 SSD test of the Sabrent Rocket 4 Plus. Now, we've already tested this a number of times in the past and we will continue to test this SSD as we work out ultimately what is the best SSD that you guys need for your PS5. They've all got their own advantages, disadvantages, pros and cons. And technically there is no single SSD that is better than any of the others. However, they all seem to perform slightly differently in different kinds of games. And much like my other tests today, we will be looking at 4 very specific games that have their own reasons for being the best they can be for these tests. So the 4 games we're looking at today, if we make our way into the Sabrent Rocket 4 Plus there, they've already been transferred over. They are the following. They are Marvel's Spider-Man Remastered, that's the PS4 game, with the PS5 attributes of Miles Morales' game imbued on it with ray tracing, improved frame rate, textures and more. We're also looking at Rocket League as well. We're going to be looking there at Last of Us Part 2, and in just a moment we'll also be looking at Ghost of Tsushima, a game that I can't pronounce right now. Again, this is the latest video in this series. That have been numerous before it though, so if you are considering getting the Sabrent Rocket 4 Plus to upgrade the storage in your PS5, I strongly recommend you watch the first couple of parts in this series. It should be in a playlist, or just look for parts 1 or 2 at least, because those are the ones we drill down a lot more into sustained read and write activity on this SSD, as well as a lot of information on the tech specs, the importance of IOPS, durability and more. And although there's lots of useful information in this video along with the other parts, those first few parts are the ones where we really get into the nitty gritty in the tech specs. But for now, let's go ahead and go into the first game that we're going to be testing today, which is the PS5 version of Spider-Man. Now again, we're going to keep this a lot snappier in these later videos. I'm going to be going through these 4 games relatively quickly. I'm going to cut out a lot of the individual stuff in the middle. I'm also, like the other videos, not going to be looking at, as you see here, I'm not going to be measuring the performance of loading to the title screen on this SSD versus the internal PS5 SSD. The reason being that with all of these publisher logos, none of these are taxing those SSDs. There's no real hardship happening there in the background. It's all forced screens there, so there's no impact there on the storage media. What we're going to be doing, however, is seeing how quickly this SSD loads Spider-Man into the city of New York there, the main open world, versus the internal PS5 SSD. So let's count in 3, 2, 1. And there we go, lovely and quick into the game. It's also worth highlighting that we're going to be sort of going around a little bit in the game, because what we also want to see is how well the game runs off this SSD as more visual assets are being required. So, for example, we're looking at, with the ground assets there, how quickly it's pulling them in. Is there any problems when we're traveling at speed? Is the game pulling in all the assets necessarily as quickly as we would need them in the game? Do bear in mind, this game does a very smart texture swap when you're playing. So as you go higher up, the game is already swapping out the stuff beneath you in favor of low texture images all the way through. So for example, while we're up here, of course, a lot of those grandiose effects are now being swapped out, but as soon as we go down nice and low, the game has now had to introduce those. And an SSD that's going to be struggling will have a lot of difficulty there swapping those out. The same goes for the frame rate and the lighting effects with the ray tracing stuff we're looking for. But right now I see no issue between what this SSD is doing here, between the internal PS5 SSD and the Sabrent that we're testing here right now. So let's move on to the next stage of testing. We're just going to very quickly see how quickly this game loads up to the northernmost part of the map to a fast travel zone. So we're fast traveling to a new area of the map, and we're going to see how quickly it loads in, and then we're going to immediately hit the ground running to force the game to pull in those extra assets as well. So let's go in 3, 2, 1. And a lovely quick turnaround there between the internal SSD and this. So again, once again, we're not going to give the SSD any time to sort of catch up there. We're going to make sure it's pulling all of those assets as quickly as we need them. And again, we're going to go nice and high, get the game to swap out for the lower textures, and then immediately force the game to bring those back in. We're not going to give the SSD a moment to pause there. So again, let's go ahead and bring them back. Oh, there you go. Some terrible timing from me there, but still, everything's running lovely and smoothly. Nothing really there to complain about. So for me personally, that ticks a lot of the boxes. Let's make our way onto our next game, which is Ghosts of Tsushima. There you go, pronounce it right next time. Here we are on that title screen, and we're going to make our way into the Legends mode of this game. And from here, we're going to be going into some of the mission stuff. We're going to go into the story mode. We're going to turn off internet-based, matchmaking. It's just us in this game. And what we're looking at here is how well the game loads a lot of the textures there. Is the frame rate going to be kept up? The lighting effects? Let's go in 3, 2, let's go for it there. 3, 2, 1. Just going to count us in. Again, we're comparing against the internal PS5 SSD. I can't see that recording. I've only got my memory there, and I can only see the Sabrent here loading the game. Do take note of the assets being pulled in here during the loading screen. Several occasions we've seen some SSDs not pull in all of the assets there on screen as it's loading the world in. We've seen that before, and this SSD seems to be doing a sterling job. There's been no drop in the textures at all. So again, we're not giving the game a single moment to let up. We're just going to go ahead and start loading into it here. We're not going to give the game much time at all to kind of struggle with any of the stuff we're trying to do. And then from here, we're going to go ahead and carry on making our way through the map. So again, I don't think I'll live very long. The way I'm playing this game is very foolhardy. But again, what we want to do is force it to work as hard as it possibly can while we're running through this map area. Again, this is going to be test 1 of 2. We're testing a much larger open area later on while we look at some of the other stuff for this. But for now, let's go ahead and continue. Hopefully my character won't die and make this playthrough fantastically short. But for now, let's carry on. Moving our way through the area. We'll take things a little higher there. Make our way through. So yes, things are running remarkably smoothly indeed as we make our way through the map. No drop in textures, no drop in frame rate. The lighting effects still absolutely great, and I can't see any reason here to kind of question how this is performing on this given game. So let's make our way into the other test scenario here. The other test, of course, is going to be on the survival mode. We've done it before in previous videos. In the survival mode, this is going to be testing a lot more to do with having as much going on screen as possible, turning off matchmaking again. Let's load it up in 3, 2, 1. Now, this area, what we want to do is force the game to have to deal with as many textures simultaneously as possible, so it can't flush many of them out. Once again, the opening pre-rendered cutscene, there's normally a bit of verbal over this that you can't hear that I've removed, because it's easier to get these videos through the copyright bots. And we can push forward all the way until when the game begins. And again, I'm going to run through this area as quickly as I can to force the game to have to pull as many assets from the NVMe as possible, while simultaneously kind of overloading a lot of the CPU activity by pulling in as many AI as possible. So let's carry on as quick as we can. And again, I'm not going to fight many enemies. All I'm going to do is aggro as much as I can to pull as many of the NPCs into this game as possible there. So again, we'll keep moving forward for as long as we can. We've already been spotted there, then we'll make our way onto the ship to pull in even more of the AI and more working assets on this game as we make our way through. So again, all of those should start the pursuit. There we go. We've got a lot more enemies to tail us. We've got a lot more in front of us as well. So again, let's give them a moment to get everything loaded in on screen as all of these enemies appear. And again, we're going to keep making our way through as quick as we can. And again, we're seeing no drop in the frame rate there, no drop in performance. Everything's running as well as I'd like to see it. And again, we'll just keep moving forward while the game is still managing all of these assets simultaneously with no drop there, which is great. So again, pushing forward. All of this is the system being taxed within this game. And again, no problem showing themselves whatsoever. We're starting to see a lot more of these AI in a single location as well as we make our way through. And yes, I think right now I'm seeing nothing here that makes me think that this SSD is not up to task here. Because the lighting effects, the frame rate, the textures, nothing has seemingly been kind of broken here. So for now, I'd say this is a success as we make our way onto the third test game, which is of course Rocket League. Now, Rocket League is a game that we have obviously featured on the channel before when we're getting ready to do the big comparisons, and it is a game that's been around for quite a long time. I think originally premiering on the PS3 generation, and then throughout the PS4 and onto the PS5 generation. This is a game that has seen numerous upgrades in terms of graphics, stability, features, and just general upgrades throughout. It was a game that was incredibly small, and over time has become a bigger and bigger game in terms of overall weight of the actual files. So what we're looking at here is we're making our way into the custom mode. We're looking at exhibition, and it's going to be just a nice simple mode where what we're looking at is the lighting effects. We're looking at the frame rate once again, and of course how quickly it loads this mode. So let's go in first at 3, 2, 1. And then from there, as soon as we're in the game, we're just going to be sort of knocking around in the game for about a minute, 2 minutes, just to see how well it deals, the SSD deals with pulling those assets as needed. This is quite a colour-rich game. It's actually a greater deal demanding than you think in terms of asset management. So again, what we're looking at here is just getting the game to just give us a lot more to be going on with in terms of graphics being pulled from that SSD, as you can see there. So again, just going to carry on. Everything seems to be running absolutely fine. It's still running at that ridiculously high frame rate as well. So again, we've got that there. We're just going to let it do its thing. We'll carry on for another 30 seconds or so. But for now, I'm seeing no struggle whatsoever of the Sabrent here. And of course, as we make our way around, we are using the AI mode here. So there's no online resources that may prove a drop in frame rate or problematic stuff there in the background. This isn't the most graphically demanding game technically, but I would say in terms of frame rate and capture of the game maintaining that, I should say, I think this is probably one of the arguably more colourful and dynamic games graphically. So there we go. I will be honest, I'm super chuffed with myself over that goal, and I think now we can make our way onto the last game, which is of course The Last of Us Part 2. Okay, so here we are on The Last of Us Part 2. We're looking at two individual segments of this game that test different kinds of silent loading. This is a game we've selected predominantly for its silent loading. Now, the first one we're going for is in Seattle Day 1 in the tunnels. So let's go ahead and get that lined up. So we're going to go ahead in 3, 2, 1. Now, this is a game with exceptionally long loading if you load from a cold state. In other words, rather than the progressive silent background loading that this game utilizes, throughout its course, if you play through it, a lot of the loading is so well hidden that you'll very rarely see this screen outside of loading from a title screen. But also, when you are loading from a cold state, these assets are massively held in the cache. Because of that, a lot of the time as this game loads, you will find more and more that as you can see, the loading is still taking quite a while. This is probably one of the heavy hitters in terms of loading for these games. And it does that so it can front load a lot of the assets that are going to be utilized throughout this whole process. And then from there, it can then do silent loading to swap assets out from cached data. This is where an SSD with a high IOPS rating will really shine, because that's where a lot of the smaller data is being pulled from. The big sequential, more than fair enough. That's all getting pulled early doors. But the huge numbers, the thousands of files that are much, much smaller that get pulled later, these are the ones where the more expensive SSDs tend to show their colors a little bit more. Now, the reason we're going for the tunnel segment of this game is it has 3 very clear silent loading sections. but also it's a part of the game where there's a lot of close-up assets. So this area here, when you're pulling the mask out, that's one area where the game is doing a little bit of the silent loading there, so it can get the assets for the next area fully injected in. If we keep moving forward, we will head into the next silent loading segment, which is directly around this corner while we go through this turnstile. And again, this is so the game can load in those high detailed textures as much as it can. And again, while we do this, the old textures still are being flushed out in the background in favour of what we're doing. And here's another silent loading segment there, while the game puts us in a fixed, slow-moving state, or sometimes completely removed from play, so we can swap those out. So this is a great area of the game to test a lot of those assets being pulled very kind of uniformly by the system, chunk by chunk. We're not going to play this section for much longer. We're only going to just double check that the assets that have been pulled in are doing it up to speed while we move through the game. And of course, as we do proceed through this area, you're going to see a lot of those lighting effects get introduced as well. So again, as we move around here, we can just generally get nice up and close and double check that the game is still handling those kind of close-up animations and assets as sharply as they need to be. And for now, I think we can say that this is running as smooth as we would like it to. And we'll keep moving forward, but for now, I think we can go ahead and switch over now to the other save area known as Channel 13. Now, Channel 13 tests a different kind of asset loading. In Channel 13, what we find, and we'll get that loading up and running, this is a much longer and slower loading segment, it has to be said. So if we get ready there, in 3, 2, 1. Of course the game is going to be annoying about that. It's autosave. Let's try that again. 3, 2, 1. Now in this segment, this is a much larger open area. There's actually a lot more space and physical textures to deal with. Unlike the previous area that we were looking at, where you're in a close-knit environment where although you are close up to things, so they can only utilize high detailed textures and not swap them out for low textures when you get a certain bit of distance. This goes the other way with a larger surface area where it can't just remove a lot of the assets very easily. There's a couple of slow moving segments in the Channel 13 part of this game that we're looking at now, but for the most part, this is a part of the game where there's a lot of freestanding assets and a lot of kind of graphical stuff that the game can't just ditch in order to preserve a lot of those resources. And again, this is an area where, although it is quite heavily front-loaded, a lot of what's going on right now is what the SSD is going to have to maintain that performance, that sustained delivery on read to make sure the game has all of the assets as quick as it needs it. So we're looking out for any texture pops. We're looking up for any of the clipping there when we go to a couple of the far off distance areas. And of course, we're looking at the frame rate and how quickly it loads the game. Once again, I can't see the original PS5 upload there, the recording of loading from the internal PS5 SSD that you can. I can only see right now while I do this voiceover the loading from the Sabrent SSD, and the game has just finished loading. So the first thing we need to do while I run forward and just rotate the camera to make sure all of those assets are at least in place, all I'm going to do is push forward as fast as I can while the game uses this time to swap out some of those textures, perhaps with some of the trees and stuff in the background. But again, we're just going to keep moving as fast as we can. This is the first kind of tight camera controlled point when the game is getting rid of some of the assets while it knows we're traveling upwards. It gives us camera control eventually. But again, as we move through this area as quickly as we can, pop, pop, we can carry on. And again, we're looking at how quickly the game is going to keep up with the pace that we are doing. Are we going to see a drop in frame rate? Are we going to see asset drops? Are we going to see any of those close textures? Get ready for the second slow moving segment of the game, where it's forcing us to allow the game to swap out some of those assets, forcing us to walk slow. And what we're going to do now is just quickly run through this area as quickly as we can in order to once again force the system and indeed the asset management to stay on its toes throughout all of this. And again, we're just going to carry on moving as quick as we can, and then eventually move to an outside segment so we can quickly look at some of the draw distance of these assets as we go through the system there. So again, this area here is obviously going to be a clouded area where you're using kind of angular coverage there to make sure it doesn't have to load the whole area in. But then you have an area like this where this is the area that we came from, where it has to keep at least some of those physical assets all the way down to the ground level. So again, lots of difference there. We can carry on and move around here. Another slow moving segment, of course. And we can have a look at a lot of those assets as we travel around. But let's be honest, it's still maintaining a lot of that quality of what we're seeing. We're not seeing much drop in what we're trying to do. All of these assets are being pulled in as fast as possible. And ultimately, I think this has done the job very well indeed. So let's come out of the game now and summarize everything we've seen today so far. So overall, the way this has loaded all of these games has been, at least from my point of view, absolutely flawless. And once again, it continues with the Sabrent Rocket 4 Plus being still one of my recommended SSDs for this system. If you bear in mind that Sabrent have also offered that they've been the first to produce a PS5 optimized heatsink. Of course, that is the heatsink we're using for today's video in conjunction with the Sabrent Rocket 4 Plus. There's a lot there that the brand has done to kind of throw in with PS4 gamers. The loading we've seen in this game and all of the previous video tests so far have continued to kind of show that this SSD is, a great pick for the PS5 system, and it's definitely one of the better price for performance drives out there. Even if it's not the best price out there in terms of capacity, I think once you compare it against the likes of the WD Black, your Samsung 980s, your FireCuda 530s and SSDs like that, the performance of this drive gives it one of the best prices for that. It's not the lowest price out there with SSDs like the Aurora 7000S, the XPG, and of course the Adlink A95 out there, really challenging things in terms of price, but still the Sabrent is up there. If not in my top 5, then certainly in my top 4. Thank you so much for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, click like. It helps me understand what I'm doing right and make sure that the next video is better than the last. And of course, click subscribe and click the bell to be notified as we test more and more SSDs on the PS5 system to help people understand what is compatible with the system and what are the best SSDs for all of those games on offer. And of course, use the links in the description to individual SSDs that I recommend, because I keep a top tally list of SSDs and heatsinks. You can use the links in the description to find the best place to buy, and we do get a kickback here on the channel that helps me make more videos for you guys. So why not support it? Doesn't cost you any extra, and I'll always be appreciated. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.